Picture this. It's 40,000 years ago. The temperature outside is somewhere around -50 degrees Celsius. Your nose hair freezes solid the moment you step outside. There's no fire, no shelter, no warm blanket waiting for you, and the nearest convenience store is, well, it doesn't exist yet, and neither does the concept of a store, or convenience, or really anything except staying alive for one more day. Welcome to the Ice Age, the coldest, harshest, most brutal chapter in human history. And somehow, against odds that should have wiped us out completely, our ancestors not only survived, they thrived. Today we're diving into the craziest, most unbelievable survival methods used by ancient humans during the Ice Age, and trust me, by the end of this video you're going to look at your heated apartment and your grocery delivery app with a whole new level of gratitude. So grab a blanket, maybe two, because just talking about this cold is going to make you shiver, and let's get into it. Let's start with something that sounds almost too strange to be true. Ancient humans during the Ice Age built houses out of mammoth bones, not wood, not stone, bones. In places like modern-day Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have discovered the remains of actual dwellings constructed from the skulls, tusks, and leg bones of woolly mammoths, some of them using the remains of over 60 different animals for a single structure. Imagine being the person tasked with collecting 60 mammoth skeletons just to build a hut. That's not a weekend DIY project, that's basically a full-time job with a body count. These structures weren't small either. Some were large enough to house extended families, and the builders arranged the bones with an eye for structural engineering that would honestly impress a modern architect. Tusks were curved and interlocked to form domed roofs, skulls were stacked like bricks to form retaining walls, and the whole thing was likely covered with hides and packed with snow for insulation. Snow, by the way, is actually a fantastic insulator, which is why igloos work, so these ancient builders basically figured out advanced thermal engineering using nothing but bones, hides, and raw survival instinct. No blueprints, no Pinterest boards, just trial, error, and probably a whole lot of frozen fingers. And here's the part that really gets me. Building one of these bone houses meant these people had to hunt or scavenge an enormous number of mammoths, animals that could weigh up to 6 tons and were not exactly friendly. So either they were taking down these massive creatures with spears and pure audacity, or they were finding mammoth graveyards from animals that died of other causes and hauling the remains back to camp. Either way, the logistics alone are mind-blowing. Try to imagine dragging a single mammoth femur, which can weigh well over 100 pounds, across frozen tundra with no wheels, no carts, and no domesticated animals to help. It's basically an ancient CrossFit competition, except the prize for losing is death by hypothermia. Now, let's talk about fire, because if you think making a campfire with a lighter and some dry logs is impressive, ancient humans were out here creating sustained fire in the middle of a literal ice age with nothing but sticks, stones, and sheer stubbornness. Fire wasn't a luxury back then, it was the single most important piece of technology a group could possess. It meant warmth, it meant protection from predators, it meant the ability to cook food and kill off dangerous bacteria, and it meant light during those brutally long Ice Age nights that could stretch for 18-20 hours at a time, depending on the latitude. Without fire, you were basically a walking snack for cave lions and saber-toothed cats. The methods used to start fires were incredibly resourceful. Friction-based techniques like hand drills and bow drills required insane amounts of patience and physical stamina. You'd have to spin a wooden stick against a base of softer wood for what could be several minutes straight, generating enough heat and friction to create an ember, all while your hands are freezing and your arms are burning from the repetitive motion. And that's assuming everything was dry enough to work, which in an Ice Age environment was not exactly guaranteed. Some groups also used a technique involving iron pyrite, sometimes called fool's gold, striking it against flint to create sparks, a method that's actually shockingly similar to how old-fashioned flint and steel lighters work today. Once a fire was started, it became almost sacred. Groups would take turns keeping it alive around the clock because relighting one from scratch was such an enormous hassle that letting it die out could be catastrophic. Some archaeological sites even show evidence of hearths that were maintained continuously for years. Meanwhile, some of us can't keep a candle lit through a power outage. Now let's move on to clothing, because if you think you know cold weather gear, you have not seen anything until you look at what Ice Age humans were rocking. Forget your puffer jackets and your thermal base layers. Ancient humans were out here creating multi-layered, tailored, weatherproof clothing systems using nothing but animal hides, sinew, and bone needles. And these weren't crude, shapeless furs thrown over the shoulder like something out of a cartoon. Archaeological evidence, including tiny-eyed sewing needles found at sites associated with early modern humans, suggests that people were creating fitted garments, tailored specifically to the body, with multiple layers designed to trap warm air and repel wind and moisture. This is basically the prehistoric version of high-performance outdoor gear, except instead of Gore-Tex, they were using Mammoth hide. And instead of a sewing machine, they were using a needle made from a bird bone. Some groups developed clothing so advanced that researchers believe it directly contributed to their ability to migrate into extremely cold, high-latitude regions that other hominin species like Neanderthals apparently struggled to survive in long term. Think about that for a second. One of the reasons modern humans may have out-survived other species during the Ice Age wasn't necessarily brute strength or bigger brains. It might have come down to who had the better jacket. That is such an underrated detail of human history. We didn't win the survival game with muscles alone, we won it with tailoring. Somewhere out there, an Ice Age ancestor was basically the first fashion designer, except instead of getting a runway show, they got to not die of exposure, which honestly might be the better prize. And speaking of staying warm, let's talk about something a little more unsettling: the use of animal fat as an essential survival resource. In freezing conditions, the human body burns through calories at an absolutely staggering rate just to maintain core temperature. This meant that fat, not lean meat, became one of the most valuable and sought-after resources for Ice Age humans. There's actually a documented phenomenon called rabbit starvation, where a person eating only lean, low-fat meat, like rabbit, can begin to suffer from protein poisoning and severe malnutrition, even while consuming what seems like plenty of food. Basically, you could eat and eat and eat and still slowly starve to death if your diet didn't include enough fat. This is why hunting large fatty animals like mammoths, bison, and seals was so critical. It wasn't just about getting enough food, it was about getting the right kind of food, and fat was basically the ancient equivalent of premium fuel. Bone marrow became an especially prized delicacy for this exact reason. Ancient humans would crack open animal bones specifically to extract the fatty marrow inside, and there's fascinating evidence suggesting that some groups would even return to old animal carcasses weeks or months later, specifically to harvest marrow that had been naturally preserved by the cold, essentially turning a frozen carcass into a long-term food storage unit. Nature's freezer, no electricity required. And honestly, when you think about it, this is one of the smartest survival hacks imaginable. Why let a resource go to waste when the environment itself can preserve it for you? It's recycling, Ice Age style. Now, let's talk about something genuinely wild. Quite literally, hunting animals that were significantly larger and more dangerous than anything most of us will ever encounter in our lives. We're talking woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant cave bears that could stand over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, and cave lions that were larger than modern African lions. And ancient humans hunted these animals using spears, some of which were eventually enhanced with a tool called an atlatl, a spear-throwing device that essentially acted like an extension of the human arm, dramatically increasing the speed, force, and range of a thrown spear. This little tool was basically the difference between confidently taking down a massive animal from a safer distance versus getting way too close to something that could crush you in a single step. Hunting a mammoth wasn't a one-person job either. It required serious coordination, strategy, and communication. Some researchers believe groups would drive mammoths toward natural traps, like bogs, cliffs, or narrow ravines, using fire, noise, and sheer numbers to funnel the terrified animal into a position where it could be more safely and effectively killed. This required planning, teamwork, and an insane level of trust in each other, because one wrong move and you're not looking at a bad day, you're looking at your last day. And let's not forget, these hunts were happening in freezing temperatures, often with limited daylight, using tools made of stone and wood against an animal that outweighed the entire hunting party combined. If that's not the definition of high-stakes teamwork, I honestly don't know what is. But it wasn't only about the big, dramatic megafauna hunts. Ancient humans were incredibly resourceful when it came to smaller, more consistent food sources too. Fishing, trapping small mammals, and gathering whatever edible plants could survive the brutal cold were all essential parts of daily survival. Some coastal groups became remarkably skilled at harvesting marine resources, including seals, shellfish, and fish, which provided a more reliable food source than chasing down massive, unpredictable animals every single time. It's a good reminder that survival wasn't always about the epic, cinematic mammoth hunt. Sometimes it was about quietly and consistently gathering enough small resources to make it through another week without starving. Now here's something that might surprise you. Ancient humans during the Ice Age were also incredibly skilled at reading the environment in ways that modern people have almost completely lost touch with. They could track animals for miles based on subtle footprints, broken vegetation, and even changes in the smell of the air. They understood migration patterns of herds down to an almost scientific level, predicting where animals would be based on seasonal changes, allowing them to position themselves for successful hunts rather than wandering aimlessly hoping to get lucky. This wasn't guesswork. This was generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through storytelling, observation, and hands-on experience. Essentially an oral database of survival information that had zero room for error. Because getting it wrong didn't just mean disappointment, it meant your family might not eat that week. Let's shift gears and talk about shelter beyond the mammoth bone huts, because not every group had access to 60 dead mammoths lying around. Caves were obviously a popular option, offering natural protection from wind, snow, and predators. But here's the thing, caves weren't always empty when humans arrived. Cave bears, an enormous species that could weigh over 1,000 pounds, also used caves as their preferred winter denning spots. So sometimes moving into a cave wasn't just a matter of walking in and setting up camp, it involved a very real, very terrifying negotiation with whatever massive predator might currently be hibernating in the back of it. Evidence from various cave sites shows signs of confrontations between early humans and cave bears, which honestly sounds like one of the most nerve-wracking real estate disputes in history. Imagine finding the perfect shelter from a deadly blizzard, only to realize you have to convince a 10-foot bear to move out first. When caves weren't available, humans got creative. Some groups dug semi-subterranean pit houses, essentially digging down into the earth and building a structure over the top, using the ground itself as natural insulation against the biting wind. Others constructed tent-like structures using wooden poles and animal hides, similar in concept to structures used by some indigenous Arctic peoples in more recent history. These shelters had to be built to withstand hurricane-force winds in some regions, and yet they managed to keep families warm enough to survive for generations. It's honestly one of the most underrated engineering achievements in human history, and nobody was getting a design award for it, they were just trying not to freeze to death, which somehow makes it even more impressive. Now let's talk about something a little darker, but absolutely essential to understanding Ice Age survival, and that's the reality of just how thin the line was between life and death. Life expectancy during this period was brutally short by modern standards, and infant mortality rates were devastatingly high. Ancient humans weren't just fighting the cold, they were fighting disease, injury, starvation, and predators, often all at the same time, with none of the medical knowledge or infrastructure we take for granted today. A simple broken bone, something that's a minor inconvenience today, could easily become a death sentence if it became infected or prevented someone from being able to hunt or gather food. This is part of why community and cooperation weren't just nice social bonuses, they were literal survival mechanisms. Groups that took care of their injured, elderly, and vulnerable members had a significant survival advantage, because more hands meant more knowledge, more labor, and a better chance of making it through the next brutal winter. And speaking of community, let's talk about something that might surprise you: the role of art and symbolism during the Ice Age. You might think that people fighting for survival every single day wouldn't have time for anything resembling creativity, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Some of the most stunning cave paintings in human history, like those found in Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France, date back tens of thousands of years, right in the heart of this brutal era. These weren't just simple doodles either, they show an incredible understanding of animal anatomy, movement, and even basic perspective techniques that wouldn't be formally rediscovered in art history for tens of thousands of years afterward. People were also creating jewelry from shells, teeth, and ivory, carving small sculptures known as Venus figurines, and using pigments like red ochre for both artistic and possibly ritualistic purposes. This tells us something incredibly important. Survival during the Ice Age wasn't purely about calories and shelter. It was also about identity, culture, and meaning. Even while facing daily life or death stakes, ancient humans still found the need to create, to tell stories, to mark their existence in some lasting way. There's something deeply human about that, something that connects us directly to people who lived tens of thousands of years before written history even existed. They were cold, they were hungry, they were constantly at risk, and they still took the time to paint a bison on a cave wall by torchlight. If that's not dedication to the craft, I don't know what is. Let's circle back to something a little more practical though, because I promised you crazy survival methods and we are far from done. One of the most fascinating adaptations was how ancient humans dealt with the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia. Without modern medical understanding of things like circulation and tissue damage, they still developed practical knowledge, likely through painful trial and error, passed down as survival wisdom, layering clothing strategically, keeping extremities protected with fur-lined coverings, and understanding the importance of staying dry, since wet skin loses heat dramatically faster than dry skin, were all critical pieces of knowledge. Some groups also used animal fat as a topical protective layer against wind and extreme cold, essentially creating a primitive version of what we might now compare to a heavy-duty moisturizer, except its main job wasn't glowing skin, it was not losing your fingers. Snow blindness was another very real danger, caused by ultraviolet light reflecting off snow and ice, which could cause intensely painful, temporary, or even permanent damage to the eyes. To combat this, some ancient groups developed early versions of snow goggles, carved from bone, antler, or wood, with narrow slits cut into them to reduce the amount of light entering the eyes, while still allowing enough vision to navigate safely. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This is one of my favorite examples of ancient ingenuity because it's such a simple solution to a problem that could otherwise be completely debilitating. No glass, no plastic, just a carved piece of bone with a slit in it, and suddenly you've basically invented sunglasses tens of thousands of years before Ray-Ban existed. Now, here's a detail that tends to blow people's minds. Ancient humans during the Ice Age had to migrate across incredibly dangerous, exposed terrain, including crossing the Bering Land Bridge, a massive stretch of land that once connected modern-day Siberia and Alaska before rising sea levels submerged it. This wasn't a quick weekend trip, this was a slow, generational migration into completely unknown territory, facing extreme cold, unpredictable weather, and entirely unfamiliar landscapes, all without maps, without any guarantee of finding food or shelter on the other side, and without any way of knowing what dangers awaited them. Just pure generational determination to keep pushing forward in search of better conditions and resources. When you think about the sheer uncertainty of that journey, it puts a lot of modern anxieties into perspective. We stress about being unsure which restaurant to pick. Meanwhile, our ancestors were migrating across a literal frozen wasteland with zero guarantee of survival on the other side, trusting nothing but instinct and desperation. Let's also talk about something a bit surprising: the role of dogs, or at least early proto-dogs, in Ice Age survival. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that the domestication of wolves into early dog-like companions may have begun during this period. And honestly, this might be one of the smartest survival partnerships in human history. These early canine companions could help track and corner prey, provide an early warning system against approaching predators, and even offer an additional source of warmth on freezing nights by sleeping close to their human companions. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it, this bond between humans and dogs that we still see today. Cuddling up with your dog on a cold night might trace its origins back to literal Ice Age survival necessity. Your dog snoring on the couch next to you is basically continuing a partnership that helped humanity survive one of the harshest periods in our species' history. Good boy indeed. Now, let's get into something unsettling but absolutely fascinating. Evidence suggesting that in the most extreme, desperate survival situations, some Ice Age groups may have resorted to cannibalism. This isn't meant to be sensationalized, but rather understood within the brutal context of the time. When food sources completely collapsed, when a harsh winter wiped out available game, and when starvation became an immediate, unavoidable threat, some archaeological sites show evidence, including cut marks on human bones consistent with butchery, suggesting that in the most extreme circumstances, some groups turned to consuming their own dead as an absolute last resort survival measure. It's a deeply uncomfortable topic, but it highlights just how unimaginably desperate conditions could become. We're talking about a level of survival pressure so extreme that it pushed people toward one of the most taboo acts imaginable, not out of malice or ritual necessarily, but out of sheer brutal necessity to keep the rest of the group alive for one more day. On a slightly less grim note, let's talk about how ancient humans preserved food for the long term, because refrigeration obviously wasn't an option. Beyond using the natural cold as a giant freezer, groups also developed methods like drying meat into an early form of jerky, smoking food over fires to extend its shelf life, and in some cases fermenting certain foods, which not only helped with preservation but could also make otherwise difficult to digest foods more nutritionally accessible. These methods required an impressive understanding of food science, all developed through observation and generational trial and error, long before anyone understood the actual microbiology behind why these techniques worked. They just knew, through experience, that doing certain things kept food safe to eat longer, and that knowledge was treated as incredibly valuable, passed down carefully from one generation to the next. Let's also touch on tool making, because the sophistication of Ice Age tools is honestly something people massively underestimate. We tend to picture cavemen with crude, clunky stone clubs, but the reality is far more impressive. Advanced flint knapping techniques allowed ancient humans to create incredibly sharp, precise tools, including specialized blades for cutting hides, scraping tools for preparing leather, and finely crafted spear points designed for maximum effectiveness against large game. Bone and antler were also shaped into needles, awls, and harpoons, some of which featured barbed designs specifically engineered to prevent fish or prey from slipping off once caught. This wasn't primitive guesswork. This was specialized craftsmanship, likely with certain individuals in a community developing particular expertise in toolmaking, essentially becoming the ancient equivalent of a skilled tradesperson, whose knowledge and abilities were highly valued by the rest of the group. And here's something that really puts things into perspective. All of this incredible innovation, the tailored clothing, the advanced tools, the strategic hunting techniques, the intricate shelters, happened without written language, without formal education systems, and without any of the collective global knowledge sharing we now take completely for granted. Every single piece of survival knowledge had to be observed, tested, remembered, and then physically demonstrated to the next generation. There was no textbook on how to build a mammoth bone hut, no online tutorial on flint knapping, no video explaining how to properly tan a hide. Just direct observation, hands-on practice, and probably a whole lot of patient correction from elders watching younger members of the group make mistakes. When you really sit with that, it makes the achievements of Ice Age humans even more staggering, because they weren't just surviving, they were actively engineering solutions to some of the harshest environmental conditions our species has ever faced, using nothing but raw ingenuity and collective experience. So when you really step back and look at the full picture, the Ice Age wasn't just some distant, abstract chapter in a history textbook. It was tens of thousands of years of constant, brutal problem solving, where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death, and where survival required an almost unbelievable combination of physical endurance, technical skill, environmental knowledge, and deep social cooperation. These weren't people who simply endured the cold, they actively figured out how to master it, using bones as building material, fat as fuel, bone needles as tailoring tools, and community bonds as an essential survival mechanism just as important as any physical tool. Every single one of us alive today exists because somewhere back along that incredibly long chain of ancestors, someone figured out how to start a fire in impossible conditions, someone figured out how to stitch together a coat that could withstand negative 50-degree winds, and someone figured out how to work together with a group of other exhausted, freezing humans to take down an animal the size of a school bus using nothing but sharpened sticks and raw determination. Next time you complain about your thermostat being set a couple degrees too low, or you're annoyed that your delivery order is running 15 minutes behind schedule, just take a second to remember. Your ancestors were out there building houses out of mammoth skulls and hunting cave lions with wooden spears just to make sure you'd eventually get the chance to exist and complain about slightly lukewarm coffee. If this video blew your mind even a little bit, make sure to like it and let me know in the comments which one of these survival methods you found the craziest, because honestly, after researching this, I'll never look at a cold winter morning the same way again.